because those passages, especially the Protestant viewpoint of headship, where Paul draws a lot from Genesis 2 and Eve being responsible for sinning, and how do you approach that argument in your book?
Well, this is covering a lot of territory. Basically, I'm just drawing on the discussions that have been taking place in terms of exegesis among competent contemporary theologians. So I would say the two crucial passages are, in fact, the Ephesians 5 passage and the 1 Corinthians 10 passage. In both of those cases, the entire argument has largely, or the main argument has hinged on the actual use of the word head, which is interpreted to mean authority. What is interesting is that there's been this big discussion of this issue in the last 10 or 15 years, where scholars have actually looked at what's going on in contemporary first century culture and how is the metaphor, the Greek word is kephale, how has that been interpreted in Greek culture? And one of the things that's interesting, we assume head just simply means authority. That's how it's used as a metaphor, and it is a metaphor in contemporary English, but it appears to be the case that that was not what was going on in the first century. Again, this gets into all kinds of discussion about comparing various texts. Grudem argues that the word head, kephale, always means authority in Greek culture. However, those who've studied it carefully and have done the parallel show, well, no, it doesn't tend to mean that. Scholars tend to argue it means source, topmost, foremost. Literally, that's what the word means. The examples that Grudem gives are examples of military command, of a commander, a general, for example, being the head of an army. But the context of marriage is different. Paul is doing something unique. Paul is the first person ever in history to use the word head to talk about what is the relationship between a man and a woman in a marriage. And so to find out what Paul means, you have to look at the context. How is he using the term? And when he's actually using the term, he doesn't attach authority to it. So in Ephesians, he connects it with nurturing. The husband is the head insofar as he nourishes the wife. In 1 Corinthians, when he's talking about the whole issue of head covering, the focus on that passage, if you look at the first half of the passage and the second half of the passage, has to do with the different ways in which people are sources of one another. So in the first part of 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the fact that the woman comes from the man, looking back on that Ephesians passage. But then he turns around in the second half of the passage and says, but in the same way, all men now are born through or come through women. And again, I would refer to the people, there's lots and lots of this discussion. I don't want to go off into too many details. I particularly recommend a very helpful man, Philip Payne, has written a lot about this in a book on Paul. But also Anthony Thistleton. It's a discussion that's going on for a while. I'm just one voice. So that head discussion is certainly part of it. The other thing is that when you actually look at what's going on in the passages, they're not talking about authority of one person over another. So the passage where Paul in Ephesians talks about submission is generally mistranslated in English translations. It's translated as an imperative, wives submit to your husband, but there is no actual verb in that verse. What happens is it's one of Paul's typical really long passages where Paul begins by saying that Christians should be doing various things. They should be singing in psalms. They should be praying. And then he says in a participle, submitting to one another, wives to their husbands. But what's really clear is that the submission that Paul is talking about in this passage is a mutual submission of all Christians to one another. Then what he talks about in the rest of the passage is he shows how wives, in the same way that all submit to their husbands, husbands in the same way that all follow Christ's love their wives. But it's really clear that everybody in the passage is being simply asked to do what they're already doing. And so he's not specifically saying only wives submit. He's talking about the manner in which this is done. And again, I'd refer people to the literature on that. Oh, and I'd also say, again, and I already mentioned that the 1 Corinthians passage, the focus is Paul is balancing the fact that women that Eve came from Adam, saying men now come from women. The only time, which is really interesting, the only time that the word authority, exousia, is used in that passage is in the passage where Paul says that a woman should have authority over her head. The translations, like the English Standard Version, translate that a woman should have a symbol of authority over her head. There is no word symbol of in the Greek. What the Greek literally says is that the woman should have authority, that is, her own authority over her head. What that means, scholars disagree about. Most of them mean it implies that the woman has the authority to speak, but that she should do so in a manner that recognizes the gender distinctions of the culture by wearing a veil or perhaps a particular hairstyle. But again, one of the things I do in my book is I try to look at the numerous ways in which the passage has been interpreted by numerous scholars and bring them all in. So it's not just simply a matter of this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. It's, well, here's what the complementarians say, but here are what other scholars say. The complementarian position is just one among many, and here's the reason why it's problematic.
Yeah, well, I like how you're kind of bringing in different voices because there are so many different perspectives on these passages, and especially like the head coverings one, because I've heard that passage being used in very, very conservative circles around why women should be wearing like veils over their heads, because Paul is kind of alluding to that.
Yeah, if that's what he's talking about. The problem is it's difficult to interpret the Greek there, and I'm a systematic theologian. I'm dependent on biblical scholars here.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado Podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.